Hey there. Let's have a sunset chat about how the United States Supreme Court lately has been setting up the American people, the average person, you, me, your kids, your grandkids, your future grandkids. The Supreme Court has been setting us up for a future of servitude and poverty. I'm going to talk about three Supreme Court cases in particular that have probably flown under your radar because they deal with issues like temporary protected status for Haitian immigrants, or healthcare access for transgender children, or sports for transgender girls. And regardless of which side you fall on such issues, they don't seem like they concern you, the average American. Most people aren't transgender. Most people aren't Haitian immigrants who need temporary protection because it's not safe to go home. But I'm going to connect the dots between these cases and the precedents set in these cases and our economic decline that we're all feeling that is hurting so many people already, and it's only going to get worse. The cost of living continuing to go up, wages continuing to stagnate or go down, good jobs disappearing. I'm going to connect the dots between that economic decline and these three Supreme Court cases. U.S. versus Skrmetti, that dealt with transgender health care for minors, children. Mullin versus Doe, that dealt with temporary protected status for certain immigrants like Haitians. And West Virginia versus BPJ, that dealt with, well, the entire state of West Virginia versus a single high school girl, BPJ, Becky Pepper Jackson, who's a trans girl and wants to play some sports. Again, set aside how you feel about these specific issues, how you feel about immigrants, how you feel about trans people. We're going to connect the dots with the economy and where the economy's headed and how the Supreme Court is screwing us over with the precedents set in these cases that don't just apply to the particular issues of the cases, but apply to all of us and to all our descendants. So, capitalism is on life support. I don't know if you got the memo about that. It's not something that's usually talked about in the mainstream media or any media. But basically the problem capitalism's having in the modern world is that throughout the whole history of capitalism, the super rich, the mega rich, have been hoarding as much wealth as they can get away with. But it's really accelerated in the Reagan era, or since the Reagan era, and since the Thatcher era in the UK. Reagan and Thatcher were two peas in a pod, as we say. You can only have intense wealth hoarding by a small number of people in your society. You can only have that go on for so long before the rich, the super rich, who are hoarding all of the wealth, start to crowd out the ability of anybody else to hold wealth. It's going to be a ridiculous analogy, but imagine you're in a pool. You and your friends are trying to have a good day swimming in the pool. But somebody comes into the pool, and they've got this big flotation device, this just gigantic flotation device that they want to ride on. Maybe it's a big inflatable yacht. And there's no room left in the pool after they have inserted their inflatable yacht and began their swim. It's like that with the economy. Yeah, we can. It's not a zero-sum game. We can make the pool bigger. But that takes time. And if the person with the big inflatable yacht refuses to get out of the pool, we're not going to be able to do what we need to do to make the pool bigger. That's our economy, our economic situation. That's the nature of our economic decline in a nutshell. Why do I say capitalism was on life support? Because this is what capitalism does. See, throughout human history, we've had scarcity of resources, scarcity of basic things people need to live, food, shelter. And humans have developed kind of a mindset. I wouldn't say that this is baked into our genetics or anything. We've just developed a mindset of hoarding resources so that we won't die when a famine strikes, so that we can have a comfortable life, but mostly for survival. And in modern times, capitalism has created so much wealth and so much technological advancement and innovation that scarcity actually doesn't exist anymore like it has throughout most of human history. But we, as the human race, are still in the habit of hoarding wealth. Again, I don't think this is inherent to human nature. I think it's just a really bad habit that we're stuck in. And I should add, capitalism reinforces this habit of hoarding wealth. Hoarding wealth is kind of what you're supposed to do as a capitalist business owner. We don't have the scarcity anymore that has prompted humans to hoard wealth throughout most of our history. But we're still doing it. At least a handful of people are still doing it. The super wealthy always do this. They take everything and leave nothing for other people. But again, it doesn't have to happen now with all of the wealth and productive capacity enabled by technology that capitalism has given us. So as the wealth hoarding continues, capitalism is going to collapse because, as you well know, not only are we being crowded out from having wealth, but they're not letting us have much in the way of income either. There's supposed to be this flow from the capitalists to the employers, or to the employees, and back to the capitalists. And when the average person can't afford much, if anything, that breaks down. You have an economic collapse. We've seen it happen before. And there can be precipitating factors, of course, like debt bubbles popping. This time it's different. We've never been in a position like this before in human history because we have the free flow of information at light speed around the globe. People are educated, people are literate. Even if you can't read, you can watch videos like this. Word can spread virally in a matter of hours. And in this context, people are waking up and realizing, hey, we don't have scarcity anymore. And the super rich are hoarding all of the wealth and all of the income. And things are only going to get worse for everybody unless this changes. This creates a problem for the capitalists because they know that we know that we're coming for their wealth that they have needlessly hoarded. And that makes them scared. They're scared of us. They're scared of the average person. When wealth inequality and income inequality gets so extreme, you start having justifications devised to support it. And typically what you do is you justify it by saying that some people are more equal than others. Some people have more of a right to a good standard of living than others do. You create these classes, not just socioeconomic classes, that's what they are, but you create classes based on other things like your lineage, like your sex or gender. Ultimately, it's going to come down to just you're either a property owner, you're either a landowner, you're either a business owner, you're either rich or you're poor. The haves and the have-nots. That's where this is headed. That's why I say we're headed for a future of poverty and servitude for the average person. But leading up to that future of pretty much universal poverty, they can't just come for all of us all at once. They have to ease us into it. Take a big chunk of the population that you can identify by some trait that they have, and take their income away, take their wealth away, take their rights away. And then do it for another chunk of the population, and then another. And at some point then, not only have you taken income and resources and rights away from a lot of people, but then you've got the people who remain, who haven't been targeted yet, they're kind of feeling good, like, hey, there are all of these different kinds of people who are second class in our society. who are predetermined to poverty by their station, by their class, but I'm one of the people who made it. I'm one of the people who isn't predetermined to poverty by my class. And so the people who haven't been targeted yet, they feel comfortable and they're okay with what's going on, more or less, you know. And they don't see their own standard of living, or they're less likely to see their own standard of living being eroded, because they're focusing on how much better they have it than the slave class. This is the connection with our 3 Supreme Court cases I mentioned. All 3 of them, what they have in common is the question of equal protection, equality under the law, as guaranteed to us by the Constitution, by the 14th Amendment, but even by the basic founding principles of this country. All people are created equal, with inviolable rights or inalienable rights, such as life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. We're all supposed to be equal under the law. And this is the principle of equal protection in the Constitution. In U.S. versus Skrmetti, in Mullin versus Doe, in West Virginia versus Becky Pepper Jackson, the major issue was that our government was trying to treat people unequally for no good reason. Essentially, we're bringing back discrimination and even segregation on the basis of traits such as skin color, or you could say race, or sex or gender, that really shouldn't matter when we're talking about how we treat people equally under the law, how we're all supposed to be equal under the law. Traits like your race, your sex or gender shouldn't matter. And the Supreme Court has set a very strong precedent in these cases, and probably some others, but these are the ones I'm focusing on. They've set this precedent that the government can get away with discriminating against you and segregating against you for whatever your identifiable characteristic is that they're using to justify, or they're using to target you. They can just point to some kind of uncertainty or controversy and say that because we don't have all the facts, it's okay for the government to segregate or discriminate against you. But imagine if someone were trying to bring back slavery and they were saying, hey, you know, we can bring back slavery because there's uncertainty about whether different races are actually equivalent, equal. And if people aren't actually equal, in fact, then maybe the law shouldn't treat them equally. The Supreme Court's basically saying that based on that uncertainty, based on that controversy, discrimination and segregation are okay. So if somebody was trying to bring back, let's say, segregation against black people, they could say, well, we've never really established scientifically that white people and black people are the same. Even though we have, but they can just assert that we haven't. And use that to justify, I don't know, whatever kind of discrimination they want to. The super rich are trying to trick us into blaming immigrants for taking our resources. The very thing that the super rich have been doing, taking everyone's resources, hoarding all of the wealth and all of the income. They are trying to blame immigrants for that. But go back to our analogy about the pool. You can imagine immigrants in that picture as being another group of friends that you've invited to the pool. So you had your first group of friends, and then maybe one of your friends invited their friends. And there's enough room in the pool for everybody, except that you have that inflatable yacht filling up the pool. one person with their big pool toy crowding everybody else out. And they're saying, hey, we could squeeze that original group before the second group came. We could squeeze you in, squished up against the side of the pool by the inflatable yacht. We could squeeze you in, but we can't do that if that second group is allowed in. So let's kick out the second group and we'll all pack into the pool in a very uncomfortable way. That's what the super rich are doing to us right now. And the Supreme Court has given their blessing to this. If you have granted people temporary protected status, you can just revoke it for no real good reason. Your reason could simply be racism. Now, what's the deal with the transgender cases, Skrmetti and BPJ? Well, that's a way for the super rich to point at their opposition, anybody who wants to start clawing back the wealth that frankly has been stolen. The super rich attack transgender people, spread all kinds of vicious defamation, misinformation, lies about transgender people, and whip up the public against transgender people. And of course, the opposition, the people who want to tax the super rich and claw back some of that wealth that they have stolen from us, from the average American, they can point to the opposition who is defending transgender people and say, hey, look at the crazy Democrats, look at the left-wing lunacy. They're supporting transgenderism. They're supporting radical pro-transgender ideology. You should support us because we're the sane ones. We're not crazy like those transgender people and their backers. Support us, the super rich. We will keep men and boys out of women's and girls' sports. We'll keep these crazy transgender healthcare providers from mutilating, doing surgeries on little kids. It's a trick. They're trying, the super rich are trying to say, hey, we're the good guys because we're against transgender people. Basically, that's what they're saying. And they're hoping that you just believe whatever you've been told. About transgender people. And thus you'll believe that anybody who supports the transgender community must be nuts, deranged, engaged in left-wing lunacy. So they're framing this, and this is another trick, by the way, as left versus right, or right versus left, depending on how you want to start. Right versus left. But that isn't it at all. That is not the issue. The issue is whether we're going to preserve capitalism at all costs, or are we going to shift gears and meet human needs for once? Because we have all of the resources we need to meet human needs. We just have to give up on preserving capitalism at all costs. It's not left versus right. It's life support for capitalism versus mercifully pulling the plug, letting capitalism, I would say, die a natural death, right? We can ease the passing of capitalism. Certainly, we should do that. But if we count the cost of trying to keep capitalism going in perpetuity, it turns out that cost is absolutely unacceptable. But let's get something very clear here. If you don't support preserving capitalism at all costs, if you support mercifully easing capitalism's passing into the dustbin of history, if you support that, you are marking yourself as, according to per the people who want to preserve capitalism forever, you become a socialist. You become a, as President Trump recently said, a godless communist. Godless communist. Wow. I support letting capitalism die and building something better, and I'm a Christian. I'm Eastern Orthodox, actually. There's no godless communism here. Here's the bottom line. In order to save capitalism, which is to say keep it on life support forever, because it's never coming back to its former glory, the good times that we've had in recent decades are a fluke, an anomaly, a historical aberration. Go listen to economists on this. Don't take my word for it, but I'm telling you, the good times we've had in the United States and other rich Western countries, it's been a fluke, and it's done. The fluke is over with. It has passed. And if capitalism isn't generating broad-based prosperity, at least for enough people in one country, it isn't going to last long. So in order to keep it alive, they have to, as I said, they have to create a tiny class of people who have versus everybody else. So let's say ultimately it'll end up being the top 1% versus the bottom 99%. The haves versus the have-nots. And simply discriminating against, let's say, women and transgender people and people who aren't white and people who aren't Protestant Christian, maybe Catholic Christian, discriminating against on these categories, on these bases, that's not going to be enough to put the bottom 99% into the category of have-nots. So how are they going to discriminate and segregate against everybody or almost everybody? And you should join the club. That's what my cup says. Join the club of people who recognize that you will be discriminated against and segregated against, regardless of who you think you are. So imagine they do universal health care. This is something people are clamoring for. Let's say they do Medicare for all, maybe, in a way. Or they just find a way to expand the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, so that everybody can have some kind of health insurance. So we have universal health insurance one way or another, whether through Medicare, Medicaid, the ACA exchanges, private insurers, But they can discriminate against you in health care based on your employment status. They can say that we do this already, don't we? We make it much easier to get health insurance if you're employed than if you're not. The government does this to us. And we're not treated equally in that regard. But they can make that inequality a lot worse. And they can make it so that if you're unemployed, maybe you have health insurance from some entity, but that entity is allowed to discriminate against you solely because you are unemployed. They can just say that, hey, you're unemployed, so we're not going to cover any preventative care. We're not going to cover anything actually serious. We'll just cover you for ER visits. And even then, we're going to take whatever money you have after you get out of the ER. Or as it may be, you have to have an inpatient stay at a hospital or clinic or whatever. Then your insurance, because you're unemployed, your insurance will only cover those emergency kinds of things. And everything else, You're out of luck until you can get a job or start a business. But you're not going to be able to start a business because there won't be any wealth, any real resources, and there won't be any economic room, any openings in the economy for you to start a business. You certainly won't have enough wealth yourself to put into your business. And there won't be any jobs. Like, you will be working. You will be considered unemployed. Or stay with me, because this stuff gets really good. You will be unemployed officially, but you will actually be working a job. They'll find a way to call you unemployed even though you're working. I know exactly what that's like. A lot of people know what that's like. So I'm a full-time caregiver right now, and I do kind of have a consulting business, which has been very, very slow, not paying the bills. And the caregiving work that I do full-time is completely unpaid. It shouldn't be, but it is. So even though I'm working, and sometimes even making a little bit of money, and should be getting paid a lot more, I'm considered unemployed. And they're going to take away my health care. This is already happening. I'm on Medicaid. They're going to take it away from me because I'm unemployed, even though I'm not. Do you see how this works? They can do this to everyone. That's what you need to understand. If we don't have equal protection of the law, if we aren't all equal under the law, then they can take away proper health care, proper health insurance for most people. They can say you're unemployed even when you're very employed. So here's another example of how they can discriminate against potentially anybody and segregate. They can say that if you own property, that puts you in a different class than everybody else. This should sound familiar. This goes way back in the United States, owning property. Yeah? We used to say that you couldn't vote if you didn't own property. Not to mention if you were black or if you were a woman, you couldn't vote, even if you did own property, but you probably didn't. But you had to own property to be a voter. This was, I think, before the 14th Amendment, before we had equal protection guarantees, even though that's kind of a founding principle of the country. So they can bring back discriminating against you because you don't own property. And when the super rich are gobbling up all the property, which is exactly what they're doing, they have a lot of clever ways to do it, but they're taking all the property. You can be discriminated against and segregated against just because the super rich stole your house. And think about that. Your kids could be segregated into different schools, into a different school from other kids, just because their parents, you, don't own your own property. So there can be segregated schools for property-owning kids, or the children of parents who own property, and everybody else. Here's another one. Your criminal record. Now you're thinking, I don't have a criminal record. I'm never going to have a criminal record. Are you so sure? That's a very easy one to segregate and discriminate against. I mean, prisons are segregation for people who have a criminal record, right? And we can legally, according to our Constitution, unfortunately, we can have basically slave labor for people who have a criminal record and are in prison. You think right now, it doesn't apply to me. Never going to commit a crime. At least not one that would send me to prison. But they can invent new crimes that are very hard not to commit. You know, they're trying to make it a crime to, in some places, I think it probably already is a crime. They have these anti-vagrancy laws where it's a crime to sleep on the street, sleep outside. So you could be sent to prison because the super rich took your house, and then you couldn't afford the rent, and maybe you couldn't afford health care anymore. So maybe your health suffered, your mental health, your physical health suffered. Not that mental health and physical health are separable. They are deeply intertwined. The brain is part of the body, and the body is part of the brain. They're an integral whole. But in one way or another, your health is suffering, and so you end up homeless. This happens all the time. Again, all of this stuff is already happening. You end up homeless, and then you go to prison because you're homeless, because it's a crime to be homeless. And now you have a criminal record which can be used to discriminate against you in whatever. And you then, because you have a criminal record, whatever job opportunities there might have been, even those jobs where you're working but you're not considered employed, you're considered unemployed even though you have a job, maybe you don't even get to have one of those unemployed jobs anymore. And maybe they completely cancel health insurance for you because of your criminal record. So you don't have any health care, you don't have any source of income. You have no way not to be homeless on the streets. And it's a crime to be homeless. So you end up permanently, running from the police, permanently living in fear of the cops deciding that, you know what, we're going to pick up this one today. What might you do under such circumstances, aside from self-medicating with drugs, drinking, just trying to make it through yet another day? Maybe if they start coming around offering slave labor, they won't call it that. They'll say that, we're going to have a contract job for homeless people. And you'll have to be deported. We will, you'll sign a contract saying that you're going to go work, in a camp in Greenland. And you'll go to Greenland, and there's no way you're going to be able to leave. Stuck there. You're imprisoned there. You're a slave there. But it's a contract job. And you're in Greenland working at, let's say, a data center, working on AI stuff, artificial intelligence. And another way they can discriminate against you, and kind of a non-traditional way to discriminate against you, is based on your healthcare needs. And this came up in that U.S. versus Skrmetti Supreme Court case that I mentioned at the start. Some plaintiffs in Tennessee, and when I say plaintiffs, I mean kids in Tennessee, were suing all the way up to the Supreme Court for access to health care that they need. But because the health care that they need is specific to transgender kids, the Supreme Court said the state can discriminate against you just because you're transgender. Obviously, they don't state it like that. They couch it in polite ways, and they try to hide that that's really what they're saying. They make it sound all complicated. But really, they're just saying, you're a transgender child. No health care for you. At least not the health care that you need. You can have the wrong health care, but not the right health care. Forget about trans kids for a second. Well, I'm going to continue on talking about that for a second here because it's very important. But forget about them for a second. Except that if the state of Tennessee, or for that matter, Congress, whoever, if the government can discriminate against you because you're transgender, because you're a child who is transgender, they can also discriminate against you because you are a child who is black or brown or because you are a child who comes from a family that does not own property, or because you are a child whose healthcare needs are just very unusual, too much. It's too much for the system to handle, and we don't know what's really wrong with you, so you're out of luck. Oh, you need a cancer treatment that will cure you for a rare cancer, but it's going to cost $1 million? Yeah, sorry, insurance doesn't cover that. According to the law, insurance doesn't cover that. Again, if they can do it to transgender kids, they can do it to anybody. That's my point. And here's the thing. Transgender healthcare goes back a century. This is nothing new. There have always been trans people. And a century ago in Germany, Weimar Germany, before the Nazis took power, there were some German scientists, one in particular, Magnus Hirschfeld, started researching the transgender experience. What's it like to be transgender? What's that all about? And how can we help trans people medically and in other ways? 100 years ago, a century ago, this was happening. And we started to figure out at that time, and this has been only confirmed since then, that being transgender isn't a choice. It isn't a mental illness either. And let's set aside this oversimplification that transgender people think that they are someone or something other than they really are. Like, the caricature would be that a trans woman is a man who thinks he's a woman. Let's set aside such caricatures, okay? Imagine that you are a man. They put male on your birth certificate when you were born. There was no question about it. You're unambiguously male. But you started to grow breasts during puberty, let's say. And this caused you distress, as one would expect, right? Your body is growing breasts, but that's not consistent with who you are, within yourself, but also socially. And, we know from experience this happens. It's called, gynecomastia, I think is how you pronounce it. And it can cause a lot of distress to boys. And it can happen to grown men as well. And so typically, health insurance will cover breast removal for men and boys with gynecomastia. Because their bodies are being incongruent with who they are, and it causes them distress. I mean, it could... And the thing about stress like that, of that kind of distress and stress, it's cumulative, has a cumulative effect on your body and your brain in particular. Stress has a cumulative effect on you over time. It wears you down. I know what that's like. You know what that's like, probably. So this is why you treat gynecomastia in men and boys who have it. Unless it doesn't cause them any distress. But if it does, you gotta deal with it. You don't let that kind of distressful incongruence eat away at them for years and years and years and years. So this is gender-affirming care, isn't it? If you can contemplate and you can understand that sometimes men and boys start growing breasts, it happens, and that causes them distress, and they need to have those breasts removed surgically, then you can comprehend what gender-affirming care is and why it would be important for transgender people. There's no delusion there. There's no denying reality on the part of that transgender kid, whether a trans girl or a trans boy. That incongruence can be so subtle that the kid grows up never knowing that they're transgender. They could make it to their 60s as an adult, never knowing. But you see, that incongruence can be subtle, can be as subtle as hormonal. It can be that when puberty hits, the child starts to feel unwell. Like there's something physiologically wrong. They start to feel like they have a hormonal imbalance. I don't know how common this is, but I suspect it's very common among transgender people. It might even be a majority of transgender people. I don't know. I'm not claiming it is a majority. I'm not claiming it's less than a majority. I think it's just very common, where you feel that you have a hormonal imbalance. You feel like your body's running on the wrong hormones. And again, this is how subtle it is, to where you have no conscious awareness that that's what's going on. You just know that you don't feel well. You feel, one could say, chronically ill. Nobody knows exactly, just yet, nobody knows exactly why some trans kids experience the surge of hormones in puberty as a hormonal imbalance, as their body running on the wrong hormones, being flooded with the wrong hormones. We don't know why that is, but there is that is an incongruence within you, right? Something isn't matching. There's a mismatch between your hormones and you, more comprehensively. And this can be catastrophic. It can set up a child for a lifetime of treatment-resistant depression. They can experience treatment-resistant depression, not because they have any problem with their physique, their secondary sex characteristics developing during puberty. They might not have any issue with that at all. They just feel sick. They feel unwell, like they're being poisoned. They basically have a hormonal imbalance. And with U.S. versus Skrmetti, the Supreme Court basically said that, as Tennessee law stipulates, it is a crime to provide the hormone therapy that trans kids need. Because that's the only transgender-specific health care that transgender kids receive, is, at least in the United States, but I think this is true in other countries as well, it's only hormone therapy, beginning with puberty blockers. Because what puberty blockers do, and puberty blockers were developed for non-transgender kids experiencing early puberty. That's also gender-affirming care in a way. Could be. I think there probably are other medical reasons for puberty blockers in precocious puberty. But anyway, the puberty blockers help the transgender kids to not develop those physical, unless they decide that they want to, right? Like the puberty blockers essentially buy time for the kid to figure out for sure whether they are trans or not. And again, it's not a choice. It's something that you discover about yourself. Again, we've been researching, we have a century of scientific understanding and clinical understanding about the transgender experience. We know it's not a choice. You go ask any trans person, maybe who's tried to deny it, who's tried to run away from that aspect of themselves and have failed. It's not a choice. It's not a mental illness that can be fixed. It's not a mental illness at all. It's just an aspect of who people are. Sometimes. Some people. And so the puberty blockers buy the kid time and buy their parents time, buy their healthcare team time to make sure that they've correctly identified that this child is a transgender person. And once they know that for sure, and they really take their time, this is not rushed on kids, the puberty blockers can be stopped, and the puberty that they would have had before starting the blockers can then ensue. So they can have a normal, natural puberty. If it's determined, if they decide, you know what, the kid's not trans, I'm not trans, they can just go off the puberty blockers, and that's that. But then, if they're old enough, and it is sure, we're certain that they're trans, then they can start taking hormone replacement therapy and go through the puberty that they need to be going through. So the puberty blockers buy time, but they also prevent the irreversible, more or less, development of secondary sex characteristics that would cause the child a lifetime, potentially, of distress due to that mismatch. And even, again, it can just be a hormonal thing primarily. Body running on the wrong hormones. But even having a kid go through that in those very formative years of brain development in puberty, for all we know, and it probably does set them up for a lifetime of possibly mental health issues, right? I want you to notice something. It's fashionable to say that being transgender is a mental illness. But we know that it isn't, because if you take a transgender kid, this is just fact, this is science. If you take a transgender kid and you do the puberty blockers, and then you do hormone replacement therapy when they're old enough, and they go through the right puberty for them and their body, they grow up to be happy, healthy, well-adjusted, no mental illness, no mood disorders, nothing, just a normal kid who just went through puberty. So if being trans was a mental illness, it wouldn't be possible to have trans kids grow up into adults who don't have any mental illness. That's what healthcare looks like. Healthcare can be preventative. Healthcare can prevent mental illness, other forms of illness, from occurring in the first place. If you get the healthcare that you need, you can stay healthy and you can improve your health. And we have a century of experience of healthcare for transgender people, preventative and that improving healthcare for transgender people, and we know exactly what to do. Now, if they can make it a crime, which they have in some states like Tennessee, if they can make it a crime to give transgender kids the health care that they need, and they're going to try to do it for adults as well. They're going to try to make it a crime for healthcare providers to adequately treat their transgender patients who are adults as well. If they can do that to trans people, they can do it to you. For example, if you are a woman and you are going through menopause, you're taking HRT, the same HRT that trans women and girls take. You're taking HRT so that you can be spared some of the effects of menopause, so that you can be healthier. It's like treating menopause with HRT is very important for your long-term health, as we now know. Now, does that mean that menopause is an illness? Maybe even a mental illness? Because it certainly affects your mind. It certainly affects your mood and your brain. Is being a menopausal woman a mental illness and or any other kind of illness? No, it's a condition. It's not a disorder. It's a very natural condition that isn't a disorder. But it does need appropriate health care nonetheless to prevent disorders from occurring as a result of not treating the condition. I know this might be a very difficult thing to wrap your mind around. A person could have a natural condition that isn't an illness or a disorder unto itself, but it could lead to a disorder if it isn't treated with appropriate health care. Isn't that interesting? Pregnancy is a very natural condition, isn't it? But it can lead to mental health issues. It can lead to death. It can lead to disability. It can lead to diabetes. Uh, it's a very natural condition. Pregnancy is not a disorder. It's good. I wouldn't exist without pregnancy. You wouldn't. Pregnancy is great. It's awesome, actually. If you're being honest with yourself, you probably, if you're not able to get pregnant, I'm not able to get pregnant. I wish I could. If I'm being honest about it, I really wish I could have the potential to be pregnant. And yet, this awesome thing, and yet it can lead to all kinds of health issues, including mental health issues. But pregnancy isn't a mental illness. And yet, we have a whole field of medicine dedicated to treating, with a healthcare modality, various healthcare modalities, treating pregnancy as a health condition, not as a disorder. That's how it is with transgender healthcare. Transgender is being transgender is having a certain condition of being. We all have our conditions of being. We all be a certain way. And that means we have different healthcare needs. Yeah. That doesn't mean that the way you are is a disorder unto itself. So I think you can see my logic at this point. If they can deny transgender people, I'm getting bit by mosquitoes. If they can deny the healthcare needs of transgender people, then they can deny the healthcare needs of pregnant people and menopausal people. They can discriminate against women in healthcare. Have better healthcare for men, less good healthcare for women. Now, why would they do that? As if, we already do this to a degree, don't we? But why would we do that? Well, to save money. Women are going to be roughly half the population, so if you can just cut healthcare for half the population, you can save a lot of money doing that. Now, you don't escape any of this by being whatever part of whatever group you think gives you an out or protection. So maybe you're a white male and you're a U.S. citizen and you were born here, or you've been a U.S. citizen from birth and you're a white male. So you think, I've got nothing to worry about, because you don't think you're part of any group that's going to be discriminated or segregated against. Again, they're going to find a way to discriminate and segregate against the bottom 99% eventually. Even potentially less. Wealth inequality, income inequality, it's just going to keep getting worse until we do something about it. That's the nature of the phenomenon, unfortunately. It's a feedback loop, a dangerous, explosive feedback loop that will destroy itself and anybody nearby. You're not going to escape that by being a white male native-born citizen of the United States, or whatever other combination of attributes you think makes you safe. And yeah, maybe you will get by. What about your kids? Or your future kids? What about your grandkids? Or your future grandkids? Your kid that you haven't had yet could be transgender. We haven't even talked about disabled people yet. Suffice to say, your kid could be disabled. You yourself could become disabled at some point in the future. Disabled people are definitely going to be discriminated and segregated against. That's already happening in various ways. So there's no escape from this. The only way you escape from this is by being extraordinarily lucky. Whatever you are, you're white, non-white, Christian, atheist, born here, not born here, whatever. The only way you escape what's coming the near universal poverty and servitude for all. You escape that through being one of the lucky few who wins the game of grabbing as much as you can. Stealing, basically. Stealing as much as you can from everybody else. You can't bet on being one of those lucky few who steals the most. So what do we do about this? What do we do about this feedback loop? Or another way of putting it is cancer. I do have university training in economics and mathematics, but I don't have a graduate degree in the subject from a fancy university like Oxford. So go listen to real economists. What do we do about this? Well, we need to be blaming that which is responsible. We need to correctly place the blame. So we need to blame the cops. No, not police officers. It's an acronym, COPS. We need to be blaming the ways that capitalism oppresses people systematically, because that's exactly what it does. The cops, capitalism oppressing people systematically. And the cops would also not just be the ways that capitalism oppresses people systematically, but also capitalism's overlords, we'll call them that, and politicians. Those are also the cops. The people who are at the top of the heap in capitalism, and they are working as hard as they can, so to speak, to keep capitalism on perpetual life support, living death. Not really doing what it's supposed to do, which is generate broad-based wealth for everybody, but instead just sucking resources in perpetuity. Those are the cops. The people who enforcing that life support. And if you come in and try to pull the plug on capitalism, they will pull the plug on you first. That's who we blame. We blame the ways that capitalism is oppressing people systematically, and we blame capitalism's overlords and politicians. The politicians bought and paid for by the super rich, those overlords, those oligarchs. And we defund the cops. Okay, you see what I'm doing there? Maybe that's too cheesy, but I think it's catchy. Defund the ways that capitalism oppresses people systematically, because it takes money to do that. It takes resources to do that. And we need to defund capitalism's overlords, the people who have too much power because they have too much wealth. They can just buy whatever they want to buy, whomever they want to buy. And so they buy the politicians. We need to defund those politicians who are bought and paid for by those capitalists. Here's an idea for a wealth tax. I'm just going to give a few examples of and I don't know that these are great ideas for taxing wealth, but here are just some wealth tax proposals that I'm throwing out there. They might be good ideas, they might be bad ideas, I don't know. Number one, a wealth tax on housing. No, not the house that the average person owns. A wealth tax on the super rich who in various ways own and are increasingly buying up all of the housing. Because again, the rich are taking all of the wealth for themselves, the super rich, and leaving none for anybody else to own. We're heading towards a future, an economy where you will own nothing, where almost everyone will own almost nothing. You know, you will own your cup that you put coffee in, maybe. But you won't own the car that you set that cup in the coffee, in the cup holder of. Let's tax. You know, when you have a big investment company owned by the mega rich, and that investment company owns a lot of housing all across the United States and is renting that housing. Let's tax that housing wealth that is owned by the super rich. So to whatever extent the super rich own housing that they are not living in, and frankly, let's just To whatever extent super rich people own housing of any kind, even their own mansions that they live in, even their own yachts that they can live in, let's tax it. Let's tax all of that housing wealth that the super rich own. And then what do? Use those tax proceeds to build housing wealth among the middle class and the poor. Start rebuilding the middle class instead of letting it decline forever. And housing is so important to that. Homelessness is such a drain, on your health, on your well-being, right? You have to have good housing. So let's tax the housing wealth held by the super rich and fund housing, and fund the accumulation of housing wealth once again by ordinary people who aren't super rich. Here's another idea. Seeing how increasingly high levels of credit card debt, I know what this is like. Sometimes you just have to put groceries on a credit card because you have no other way to feed yourself and your family. And mortgages, you have to have housing, as we were just saying. And so people are going into so much debt just for the basics of life. They're putting health care on the credit cards. We have to borrow for everything. You borrow for your car. Debt on credit cards, paying for health care and groceries and car repairs, car loans, mortgages. How about we start taxing all of that debt income that the super rich are earning off of our backs? Whoa, that's a radical idea. All that money that the credit card companies are making, let's tax that. Now, how is that a wealth tax? Well, because all of that debt that the middle class and the poor all of the debt that the average American owes to the super rich at the top, that debt is wealth for them. It gives them passive income, so to speak. So let's tax that income. Let's tax the income that the super rich are making off of the indebtedness of the average American. Even though that sounds like an income tax, it's actually a wealth tax. There's no way they can dodge that. If they want to collect on your credit card debt, they're going to have to pay the tax to collect on it. If they want to keep collecting your mortgage payments, they're going to have to pay the tax on that. And what do we do with those tax proceeds from taxing all of that income that the rich are making off of the indebtedness of the average American? Well, we help people pay off their debts, help people pay off their mortgages, help people pay off their credit cards, right? Help people build wealth and get out of debt. And here's another idea for taxing wealth. You might have heard that wealth taxes can be difficult to implement on the super rich because the super rich can play games, perform tricks to hide their wealth. So, for example, they can shelter their wealth in private companies, not publicly traded companies, private companies. And it's really hard to evaluate the value of a private company and a super rich person's ownership stake in that private company. Well, here's the thing. Private companies own real assets, physical assets, assets that can be easily given a monetary value. So you tax those private companies based on their actual tangible assets or real assets, but also to kind of get at a little bit of the measure of the private entities, the private companies' intangible wealth, intangible assets. How about we look at the power that the private company has to underpay its employees relative to what would be a living wage? So just for a simple example, let's say you have a company that is owned by some billionaire trying to avoid a wealth tax. We'll call the company the XYZ company. Maybe it's owned by the world's first trillionaire. I don't know. But a lot of the wealth of the XYZ private corporation is intangible. It's intangible in the sense that they have the power, the market power, and the contractual power, and the collaborative power, and as they have this intangible ability to underpay their employees relative to what would be a living wage. So here's what we do. We can find out how much they're paying their employees. Well, add up all of that shortfall relative to a living wage that they're underpaying their employees by. Just sum it all up, get the grand total of how much every year they are underpaying their employees by relative to a living wage, and tax that underpayment at some high rate, like 25% or something. That's actually a wealth tax when you think about it, because they've established this private company so that they can have wealth that's difficult to evaluate the value of so that it can be taxed. All right, well, tax them on their ability, their intangible wealth, which is an ability to underpay their employees. That's really radical, isn't it? I feel like the world's first trillionaire would, I don't know, take over the government or something rather than allow such a tax to be imposed on him and his companies. Still, we have to try, don't we? Now, you might be thinking, if we do wealth taxes, if we defund the cops, the ways that capitalism oppresses people systematically, and capitalism's overlords and politicians, if we defund the cops, could that cause an economic downturn? Yeah, sure, of course. Do you know what we do in that instance? So, like, you have these super rich people. They're not really driving all that much economic growth. They're actually stifling economic growth. But they don't want the economy to collapse because that's bad for their wealth accumulation, right? So they try to keep the economy humming along in some semblance of a halfway acceptable way, right? So that they don't lose out. So that they keep the economy humming along enough that they can continue grabbing more wealth and income for themselves, bottom line. So if we start taxing their wealth, yeah, they might do less of that activity to keep the economy working just well enough to enable them to continue grabbing more and more and more. Yeah. So what do we do in that case? That sounds like a very bad scenario, right? What do we do? Well, it's actually not a bad scenario. It's actually a wonderful scenario. We don't want that kind of bad economic activity. We don't want the economy being sustained by super rich people keeping the economy churning and functioning only so that they can accumulate more wealth and steal from everybody else. We don't want them to do that. So by taxing their wealth, if that makes them, to whatever degree, stop doing it, wonderful. Now, does that mean somebody no longer has a job? Does that mean somebody cannot afford whatever anymore? Does that mean that the economy experiences a downturn? Maybe. But it's the good kind of a downturn because it means that the bad actors, the bad activity has decreased. So what can we do? We can pick up the slack with good economic activity. And we can do that without raising inflation. So here's what we do. Tax wealth, put the wealth back in the hands of ordinary people, rebuild the middle class, grow the middle class, lift people out of poverty. And if the wealth taxes and doing this starts to cause an economic downturn, the government can print money and use that money to stimulate the good kind of economic activity that builds wealth for ordinary people. And yes, the government will have to borrow. And who do they borrow from? They borrow from the super rich. Predominantly, right? And as the super rich continue to hoard more wealth, the government increasingly has only one group to borrow from, and that's the super rich who have all of the wealth. The government like you might think China or whoever holds most of the U.S. public debt. No, No, our own citizens, our own super rich people hold our debt. Now, you can go buy a U.S. Treasury bond as well and hold some of our government debt. Anybody can do it. But the super rich, because they have all the wealth, or most of the wealth, they get to hold most of the government debt. And that gives them control over the government, always borrowing more and more and more from the super rich who are getting richer and richer and richer, gobbling up all the wealth. That gives the super rich increasingly greater control over the government because the government is indebted to them. So we have the economic downturn because we're taxing all that wealth that the super rich hold. And the government goes and prints a bunch of money to stimulate the economy in ways that build wealth for ordinary people. The government will legally have to go and borrow from the super rich to fund this new money that they have injected into the economy, to offset it. This is a legal requirement. We could change the law, but I don't know that we should. Because here's what they can do. After they have created this new money and put it into good economic uses that build wealth, and they've borrowed the same amount from the super rich, the very next thing that they can do, and this is, the Fed can do this, the central bank. The Fed can go and buy bonds, buy back government debt. The government can buy back its own debt. And it has an unlimited capacity to do this, by the way. There's no limit to how much U.S. Treasury bonds that the Federal Reserve can buy back. And that truly is creating money out of thin air, right? Because the Federal Reserve doesn't have to borrow from anybody in order to buy back government debt. Isn't that cool? There's a backdoor for printing money, even though the law says that you can't. So the bottom line is, you print brand new money out of nowhere, effectively, through these tricks, like the Federal Reserve buying government debt. The government issues new debt, and then the Fed buys that an equivalent amount of debt out of the bond market. So it all balances out. The government is not really indebted any more than it started out as before it created the new money and put it to good economic use. And we've actually, from the standpoint of preventing inflation, because if you just go around injecting new money into the economy, you will create inflation. The way that we've gone about preventing inflation is by taxing the wealth of the super rich, which creates a slack in the economy, which is an opportunity for better economic activity than would have otherwise occurred at the direction of the super rich. Again, you're preventing inflation because you're essentially funding this government spending to rebuild people's wealth. You're funding that by taxing wealth. So it's not an inflationary pressure on the economy. If we're doing this, if we're doing the wealth taxes and we're using the opportunity to stimulate the economy in a way that takes back government debt from the super rich, the government's buying back its own debt, and we're doing this in a way that doesn't create inflation because it's being offset by reduced bad economic activity by the super rich, then ultimately what are we doing? We're reducing the government indebtedness to the super rich while building wealth among ordinary people, while lifting people out of poverty, rebuilding the middle class, and decreasing the wealth, not just of government debt, but of other kinds of unjustly gained wealth of the super rich. So in more than one way, we're giving the super rich less control over the economy. They're going to be holding less government debt, so that means they will have less control over the government, and they will hold less of the real resources in the economy, and so they will have less control over the economy. So what does this all amount to then? It amounts to empowering ordinary people, empowering the many instead of the few. Because what we've been doing is essentially socialism for the super rich. The government has been propping up the super rich, empowering them, enabling them, and disempowering and impoverishing everybody else. If we don't do this, what happens? What does failure look like if we don't tax the super rich? If we don't tax if we don't start taxing wealth instead of taxing work, if we don't defund the cops, the ways that capitalism oppresses people systematically, and capitalism's overlords and politicians. If we don't do this, what does failure look like? You've heard of the gig economy, right? And you've heard of feudalism, right? It looks like an AI-driven feudal gig economy. And there would be a king. The most likely candidate for king right now would be the guy who is the first trillionaire. I'm just saying. The super rich are investing like crazy in all of this AI stuff. And I think I know why. It's because AI is going to enable, so-called artificial intelligence. It's going to enable unemploying people, making people unemployed, and yet still extracting work from them. Because what you can do, if you're a super rich whoever, you can say that, hey, we've replaced 25% of our employees with AI. So we don't have those employees anymore. AI's doing the work that they used to do. But guess what you can do? You can kind of sort of keep those employees on, but as babysitting the AI, as supporting the AI, as keeping the AI functioning and correcting it when it screws up. It could be like a gig job, right? So you have an app, and the app tells you, oh, you have this AI task today, and you're going to spend 3 hours on this AI task, and then there's another one for another 4 hours, and oh, there's another one for another 7 hours. And you get paid minimally. You get paid peanuts to do these AI training and babysitting tasks. And officially you're going to be unemployed because you're barely making any money. Anybody can do this AI babysitting stuff, right? It can be outsourced. There's somebody standing by in Greenland to do it if you don't want to do it. So you're getting paid peanuts. You're competing with slave labor overseas and at home and in prison. People in prison in the United States of America are going to be doing this AI babysitting. Because it isn't real artificial intelligence. It's not comparable to us. I don't know that it ever could be. Maybe it could. I doubt it. I think the super rich who are funneling so much into this, maybe they are hoping that AI will be equivalent to human intelligence at some point soon. That's like maybe their fantasy, and they feel like this human equivalent or superhuman AI can save us from ourselves, can save them from themselves. They're like drug addicts, right? Their drug is wealth accumulation, insane, excessive, compulsive wealth accumulation. That's their drug. And they keep hitting it, taking their hits. And they're hoping that the super intelligent AI will save them from the consequences of their inability to stop gobbling up all the wealth. It's not likely to happen, right? So instead, all of the jobs are going to disappear. All of the employment opportunities are going to disappear. You're going to be competing against slave labor in U.S. prisons and abroad, and this is what immigrants are for, right? Slave labor. Look into that. That's why we're taking away equal protection from immigrants, so they can be used as slave labor. I mean, they already have been. They already are. Prisoners are already being used as slave labor. You see how equal protection, that principle, gets in the way of keeping capitalism on life support? Because to keep capitalism on life support forever, eventually most people have to effectively be slaves, serfs. Maybe we'll use a nicer word, because this is neo-feudalism, right? People have to be serfs. There's lords and serfs, and they are not equal. So you're making peanuts, babysitting AI, and you have a feudal lord, a tech feudal lord that you are under. The government considers you unemployed. And yet, you're enabling the AI to do the job that you used to do before you were replaced by AI. Isn't that funny? Are you actually replaced by AI if you're behind the scenes making sure that the AI is doing what you used to do, helping the AI to do what you used to do? So notice what this AI stuff is really going to be used for in all likelihood. We can hope that AI is equivalent to human intelligence at some point or becomes superhuman intelligent. We can hope for that, but more likely than not, especially anytime soon, AI is simply going to be used to drive down wages, to unemploy as many people as possible while still extracting work from them. See, that's the thing. Capitalism's on life support. The basis of capitalism is the employer-employee relationship. That's breaking down now. Because that gig work is independent contractor. You're not an employee. It isn't a job, it's a gig. Capitalism's breaking down. And if we keep it on life support forever, capitalism stops working the way it's supposed to, which is employers and employees. And everybody becomes either a super rich, effectively tech feudal lord, or you're a serf, an independent contractor who babysits and enables and trains AI. That's what failure looks like. Lords and serfs. So, what do? We blame the cops, the ways that capitalism oppresses people systematically, and capitalism's overlords and their politicians bought and paid for. Blame the cops and defund the cops. Defund the ways that capitalism oppresses people systematically. Defund the people doing this, perpetuating this system, capitalism's overlords and politicians. And keep in mind, through all of this, equal protection of the law, equality under the law for all different kinds of people, that gets in the way of the super rich dominating us, taking everything for themselves. They're attacking equality under the law for immigrants and for transgender people. They're hoping that you won't notice that that's setting a precedent, that everybody can be divided into just those two classes, the lords and the serfs. Unequal under the law. Totally unequal. We all have to stand together. We all have to support each other in insisting on equality. Otherwise, we'll be divided against each other and we'll be defeated.